even if people are still coming in, I think we can start. Welcome to this next workshop at our 7th European Conference of the Platypus Affiliated Society. This will be a workshop by Alexander Berezin from Союз Марксистов, the Union of Marxists, Marxist organization based in Russia, but we can talk about a lot of stuff I think later, which is called Embeddings, Aufhebung und Denkökonomie, and which Alexander introduced with the following line: connecting some dots between machine learning, neurobiology, and the 19th century German philosophy. This workshop will have the following format, about 30 minutes of input by Alexander, and then we will have a Q&A session, and we'll see how long that goes. But yeah, a warm welcome to Alexander, and then we take it away.
Should I stand or sit? Is it?
I think. Well, what's more comfortable to you?
I don't. I think that. Yeah. Yeah. So the description might be confusing to say the least, and the rest of the talk would be even more confusing because, unfortunately, it is based on a publication that would probably take like a full academic lecture to present just in the basic details. And here we have 30 minutes. So I'll do what I can, but I'm still not sure if I can fit it all in. Yeah, so I think I'll start with the problem that I was trying to solve first. So if you've ever been in leftist organization, you probably know the problem of discussion. That whenever we try to... I can try, okay, but not sure. Okay, so whenever we try to solve any contradiction in our views, we usually end up splitting. Or not necessarily splitting, but generally going into that direction. Finding somewhat similar to a consensus is usually really hard, and especially hard when the question has serious material implications for the interlocutors or the discussion participants. And as you can imagine, the war in Ukraine is one of those very hard topics where the outcome of the discussion cannot be satisfactory to everyone at the same time, because some people have their friends and loved ones on one side of the conflict, some have on the other side, and there's just no easy solution for that. So, trying to solve this problem, we developed two theories. One of them is mine, which is the one that I'm going to present. My theory is based on what I'm also doing for my main work, making money, and that is research in artificial intelligence. So I'm trying to base my theory of handling a proper discussion on what we know about intelligence. And yeah, let's start from what Marxism tells us about it. So the model of intelligence in Marxism is based on the idea of that we know as reflection, and it is a very old philosophical theory that was modified for Marxism by Lenin. The baseline of that theory is that although we do not have direct access to the material world, because we perceive it through our senses, we still build a model of that world in our minds, and that model is grounded by what we perceive. So although what we see can be somewhat subjective, so for example, I don't have the greatest vision, so when I look at that poster, I just see the Marx and Engels, but maybe someone who sits closer and has better vision can actually make out the text and see that it's more than it seems, let's say. Yeah. So Lenin's idea was to solve the problem of the theory of reflection that was initially pointed out by Berkeley. That is that there is an insurmountable gap between the objective reality and our model of it. Although there is still a gap in Lenin's model, it's kind of not as big of a deal because our model gets shaped by our practice, meaning that we eventually retain the parts of our perception that are actually important for what we are doing. And when people are doing the same thing, so when lots of people are doing the same thing over and over, they more or less converge to a similar model, which also happens to more or less coincide with objective reality. And therefore, there is no fundamental conflict between the model and the reality, and the problem of reflection is kind of solved. Kind of, because that's exactly what I'm going to critique today. Yeah. So I don't think that Lenin actually solved this problem completely. So the question about what information we retain and what we throw away is still not entirely solved in Lenin's model, because the thing in itself, so the thing that actually exists in objective reality, is obviously a lot more complex. It has a lot more information. It consists of atoms that we can't even see, and we obviously cannot know anything about them just from looking at the thing. And usually the representation of what we see in our mind is like many orders of magnitude more compressed than what it would take to actually store the full information, if it was even possible. That's actually a good question in physics right now. Yeah, so let's take a map as an example. So if you try to download the map of Berlin on Google Maps, it would take about 100 megabytes on your device, which is, if you think about it, it's really small. It's about 30 bytes per capita for every person living in Berlin. And it fits pretty much everything you realistically need to live in Berlin. So to know how to get from one place to another, where to eat, where to sleep, what public transport is available, probably a lot more. Yeah, I haven't used it for in a while. Yeah, this is possible because the problem of navigation was being solved for like thousands of years already, and people developed very useful abstractions such as roads, buildings, and things like that, which can be represented with just a few numbers. And that's how you get such a compact representation of a map. But here is a problem. We can't necessarily build a similar abstraction a priori for a thing that we haven't interacted with before, because we don't really know what parts of an object to consider, or which parts to forget. And if we follow Lenin, then to know that we first need some kind of practice. So we need to interact with the objects of our research, and that's not always feasible, because sometimes this interaction is very expensive, sometimes it's dangerous, and sometimes it's just unethical. So, for example, again with war, all lessons in war are paid for in human lives, obviously, and we would really want to develop a system that does not require testing every possible thing we can do, getting a lot of people killed in the process, and only then figuring out what to do. We'd like to have at least some prior, at least a guess about what would be the optimal course of action based just on rationally analyzing the object and without actually interacting with it. So another problem is with sciences which actually don't interact with objects of their research. So for example, astronomy. No one ever tried poking a star with a stick, obviously, and yet astronomy is quite a sound science. It's also a question about what we mean by practice anyway. So if we take our organization, for example, the Union of Marxists, it was initially marketed as an organization that does theory and practice jointly. Well, that never really worked quite well. We did theory, we did practice, but we never managed to join them. And yeah, so regarding practice, there are three separate branches of it right now, or there were until recently. Those branches were labor union organizing, environmental activism, and economic cooperation. So like trying to replicate the success of the Mondragon Corporation in Spain or something like that. Eventually it all didn't work for different reasons. So the labor union organizing ended up being more relevant to Marxists than to the labor itself. The environmental activism came into a contradiction with the cooperative movement, because it turns out that if you want to outcompete capitalists in their own game, you might need to question a few environmental regulations for that, and at that point we will just have two arms that do contradictory things. One is trying to protect the environment, another is trying to do something better to the environment, and eventually it all falls apart. I won't be talking about that much today, and instead I'll try to talk about the lessons we actually get from it. Yeah, so the question about practice is how exactly do we choose which practice helps us understand the object of our research. So for example, it's pretty common for Marxist organizations to do labor union organizing, but the link from organizing to a revolution is tentative at best. So there's like this idea that if we increase the costs of labor for the capital, then the capital has to improve the means of production, and that kind of leads to communism at some point in the indefinite future. There's also the idea that we just need people to be able to organize if we want revolution, but neither of those approaches really led to something yet. And the problem here is that the object of research for Marxists is the entire society. And there's just not that much you can do to interact with the entire society at the same time and make some conclusions that could be later generalized. So it's a lot more like astronomy, where you cannot actually do experiments on the thing you investigate. You have to instead do all of your work on paper and then see if the theories you make correspond to what you actually see in reality. And the way we see how they correspond is that we make models, then using the models we make predictions, and then we see if predictions correspond with observations, and if they do, then we consider the model good, and otherwise we throw it out. And at this point you might say, okay, so we just arrived at positivism. Nice. Isn't that exactly what Lenin criticized? Yes, and I'm going to, in the best traditions of Marxism, criticize the critique of Lenin. So you know the book Materialism and Imperial Criticism, where Lenin was basically rolling over the positivists, the idealists, and especially the small and currently not very well represented group of Marxists, which apparently were quite numerous in Russia at the time of Lenin. And those were the followers of Ernst Mach, who is an Austrian philosopher and who represents the logical positivism movement. I think. So the main theory of Ernst Mach was what I think I wouldn't translate to English because it doesn't sound well. In German, it's Denkökonomie. So I guess you could understand it as economy of thought, which doesn't sound very well. Economy in the sense not economics, but reducing the amount of. So what Mach postulated is that our brains work in such a way that they always want to save on thinking, save energy. And from that follows that the way to develop good theories is to make them simpler, or rather more economic, which is not necessarily simpler, but usually it is. And we know that Mach was wrong, at least about scientific theories, because at least physicists actually tried this approach. They had string theory, supersymmetry, which were basically just mathematical constructs made as simple as possible to explain everything that we see. And it's hard to say that they didn't work because it wasn't even possible to test them. They're just abstractions that exist completely in their own realm, and there isn't even an experiment that can actually verify them. Which is not a good conclusion to arrive at. But it turns out that Mach was still half right. And the right part is that the human brain actually does work like that. So it makes the brain usually consumes like 20% of the entire energy of the body, while being like only 2% in weight or even less. Okay, that's not relevant. And it would make sense for evolution to optimize for reducing the amount of energy that the brain consumes. We have a lot of interesting proof that that's exactly what happened. I probably can't fit it in right now because yeah, already 20 minutes. Oh, okay, nice. Yeah. So the most important part of it, and yeah, what everything else we will depend on, is the mechanism of predictive encoding. I think that's the word. And that is the idea that the brain is actually constantly trying to predict what it will hear, for example. So when you're listening to something, each time you hear a word, your brain generates like multiple options for which word would follow next. And depending on how well it does it, you understand the speech better or worse. So for example, when we are at a train station and there is an announcement there, I have a hard time understanding because I don't speak German very well, or rather I just don't have a lot of practice in German. And even if I know the words that they're saying, it's hard for me to decipher it because my brain doesn't have a very good understanding of which word to expect after the previous word. But the people who speak German natively can understand the exact same transmission. Yeah, even if they have the same hearing, the same everything, just because they know the language better. Yeah, so probably have a hard time understanding my talk now because what I'm saying is quite unpredictable for anyone who is not into this topic. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. We also have proof that this is not just a thing about human brains. It's actually a general property of any system, the goal of which is to represent the objective reality. So any kind of artificial perception system, let's say. The property is that when we reduce the amount of power it has available, it has to develop those predictive encoding abilities. Yeah. So now we get into the machine learning part. And okay, this is a little bit of a rough transition, but it turns out that if you train a neural network to predict the next word in a sequence, in a text, then a very interesting thing happens. The network creates internal representations of words that, yeah, those are actually vectors. So if you know anything about math, you know that vectors are just lists of numbers, essentially. So we associate every word with a few numbers, and then we get a whole lot of interesting properties. So for example, if you have antonyms, so words with opposite meanings, like for example hot or cold, then the embedding for cold, for example, would roughly correspond to minus the embedding for hot. And there are a lot more complicated structures you can make like that. So, for example, yeah, so the classic example here is that king minus man plus woman equals queen. I don't know why it's such a famous example, but everyone just uses it for some reason. Also, big plus less equals small plus more, and yeah, you can make your own examples. Yeah, another interesting property is that if you train two neural networks completely independently on different languages, and then plot those, so you plot the embeddings, then it turns out that they actually correspond very well, in the sense that the words with the same meaning have roughly the same position in the space for embeddings, which is also, by the way, called the latent space. Yeah, that's now getting pretty complicated. If I had a beamer, I could show a picture of that. I don't know if it makes any sense trying to do it here. Yeah, probably not, a bit too small. Yeah, so I'll just have to believe it.
Can I ask you to repeat the example with the king and the queen?
Yeah.
Like, just if you don't have it written, a little bit slower.
Yeah, king minus man plus woman equals queen. Okay, yeah, maybe it doesn't make as much sense when you hear it, but if you try to play, yeah, okay, thank you. If you try to play with it a bit, then like rearrange the terms, it might start to make sense. There are a lot more interesting examples of that, but yeah. Yeah, so, but the most important property of embeddings is called isometry, and that means that, okay, the bottom line is that embeddings of words that are similar in meaning are also located close to each other in the geometrical sense. And that allows to use embeddings for example, classification tasks. So if you want to determine if two texts have a similar meaning or not, then you can calculate their embeddings and see if they are close or not. Yeah, so a good example of that is how modern search engines work. So when you type something into Google, it not only shows you the pages where those exact words that you typed are found, but it also shows texts which are similar in meaning, but phrased in perhaps different words. And that is actually called semantic search, as opposed to literal, probably. Yeah. So you can also generalize this idea into more complex objects, for example, the entire text or images, and that is also how reverse image search works. If you ever tried that. Yeah. And when you do generalize it to more complex objects, then another interesting property emerges. That embeddings also compress information. And yeah, you can't always recreate the information that was originally compressed by an embedding, but you can usually get something roughly similar. So here again a beamer would be very nice. But if you have internet, you can try Googling or rather searching on YouTube. I think that's called latent walk. Can I write it somewhere? Probably not. Walk in the sense of walking. So, yeah, try that. And yeah, you'll get some somewhat disturbing videos where images morph into each other. I don't know, maybe some of you have seen it before. It's just basically a machine learning toy, which some people actually make to, some people actually use to make videos, but those people are kind of crazy, and I'm not saying that it's actually useful. It's just an interesting example of what can be done. So the mechanism, yeah, I guess I can give you some time to look at it if you want. Yeah, so the mechanism of how this works is that you can, for example, have two completely different images. Then we calculate the embeddings for both of them, which forms a line in the latent space. And then we just move across that line and recreate the... So this is, of course, a line of points, and each point represents some kind of image. Not each one of them makes sense, but we can still try to recreate them and just see what happens. Yeah, so in a geometric sense, that means that there are images between images. And that is another very important notion to understand here. Now, what's even more interesting is that another rather recent scientific paper showed that you don't actually need neural networks for that. Or rather, you can just use conventional compression algorithms, so like, zip archives, things like that, to calculate something very similar to embeddings, that you could also use to classify text, or not text, basically any information. It's a bit more convoluted, but it works. And the important conclusion from all that part is that prediction, classification, and compression are fundamentally related processes. So you can say that they can all be explained as generalization, and the idea here is that if you need to classify things, you need to determine their common properties. But if you have those common properties, then you don't need to store those properties individually for every object. You can just take them and store only the distinct properties for every object. And that's basically how any compression algorithm works. Yeah, so now we finally get back to Ernst Mach, and it turns out that he basically predicted all of that. His idea was, I won't repeat it, but although we cannot take the economy of thought as a sufficient criterion of truth, it still turns out that once a scientific theory is developed, it always ends up more economic than the preceding theories. What it means is that it takes less parameters to describe a system in the new theory than it took in the old one. So perhaps the easiest example here would be the transition from the geocentric model of the solar system to the heliocentric model. And the problem with that transition is that you cannot actually experimentally say which model is correct, because at least at the accuracy available to people in those days when that transition was happening, those models produced rather similar results. And therefore the choice had to be made on different factors. And now we just think that the heliocentric model makes more sense. But if you try to formalize it, then the way in which it makes more sense is that it takes less parameters to describe the solar system in the heliocentric model. Because in the geocentric model you have epicycles, and then more epicycles on epicycles, and yeah, it snowballs into incredible complexity if you want to get correct predictions out of it. But in the heliocentric model, you just have ellipses for each planet, and you can describe every ellipse with just a few parameters, and the number of parameters doesn't change if you need more precise predictions. You just need to clarify the exact values of those parameters. Okay, maybe it's a little bit complicated. A little bit more complicated than that, but the general idea is the same. Yeah, and as another example, okay, when radioactivity was discovered first, it really didn't make any sense at all in the existing framework of physics. But in a rather short time, new physics was developed, where not only did it make sense, but the new physics also described a lot of the processes that were like hand-waved before. So like the question of why do stars burn, or where did atoms come from? And the new physics not only described all that, but did it in a more simple fashion. So of course simple here is not very intuitive, because not a lot of people would say that the general theory of relativity or quantum mechanics is simpler than the classical mechanics, but in the sense of the parameter efficiency, they actually are. So the bottom line is that we don't have to follow the framework of the Denkökonomie, but it's more like this framework follows us. So yeah, whenever we uncover some new truth, it turns out that it is simpler to represent the truth than it was with the ideas we had before. Okay. Yes, probably need to wrap it up. Yeah. And you know what? I still didn't get to the actual method of discussion that I was suggesting.
Yeah, then
So yeah, probably need to skip a few parts. So the method time suggestion basically boils down to three principles that are derived from the theory that I described before. The first principle is, likely I don't have to derive it because it also exists in dialectics, and it is that when we are arguing, we cannot assume that any party in the argument is completely or absolutely wrong. In dialectics, that corresponds to the idea that every person is a bearer of relative truth. So there is like absolute truth that we cannot achieve anyway, and there are many relative truths that come into contradictions, synthesize, and eventually get closer to the absolute truth. Yeah, so that is quite hard to enforce, but easy to understand at least. The second rule is a bit easier to enforce, but a bit harder to understand. It is called regularization of thesis. I didn't have to explain where that name came from, but I think I could explain the logic behind it. The logic is that before proceeding to the logical analysis of the thesis of the parties in the discussion, we have to reduce the number of concepts that they use to the absolute minimum. Ideally by expressing some concepts through others, or by explaining why they cannot be expressed through others. Yeah, basically both ways help. This also helps ensure that the participants in the discussion actually understand what's happening, so they do not use the same term in different ways, which often happens with terms like say, democracy or dialectics, other things. And finally, the soft principle is that at each stage of the discussion, there must be an opportunity for an external observer to enter into the discussion without reading all of the material that precedes it. So, for example, when two people argue, especially on a very theoretical topic, it looks like so basically that's what was very commonly done in the times of our classics, of Marx and Lenin, because people had a lot of time and not a lot of means to communication. They were basically writing entire books. So one guy wrote a book, another guy wrote a book as a refutation of his thesis, then the first guy wrote another book as a refutation of his thesis, and therefore we get like these ginormous libraries, and we are somehow we have to read all of that before even starting to discuss the problems that we face today, which is not a great situation, especially for the young people who want to do something but can't really spend like 10 years reading all of Marx and all of Lenin, then all of Gramsci or whatever. Yeah. Today, of course, with the internet, we kind of went from that to just arguing more directly about each specific point, which is arguably even worse, because now nobody can actually keep the bigger picture in mind, and it always just devolves into character assassinations, ad hominems, and all that stuff. So, the suggestion here is that, for example, the people who are arguing could write like short digests of what they were arguing about. That's one option. Another option is just that and another option is that they actually bring new people at every turn in the discussion, and they have to explain what's going on to that new person before they can continue. Which is, a bit hard to enforce, but at least we can try. So that's basically the rules. To be fair, those rules are still purely theoretical. We did not test them, at least at full scale yet, so you're welcome to do it yourself. Yeah. What did I miss? Did I miss anything important?
Thank you, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, now there's room for Q&A. So, raise your hands. I see a hand.
Okay, thank you. Let me say two things to introduce it. I very much enjoyed your teaching, your presentation, and I feel it's everything but Marxism. And I want to get one thing out first. You please correct me if you see it differently. How I learned it in scientific theory is that with each measurement you interact with the object, and it's impossible through a measurement not to interact with the object. So it would indeed be untrue that we do not poke the star with a stick. We do, right? We measure it with a telescope. The telescope measures the radiation, and the radiation interacts with the telescope. It's quantum linked with where it came from with the star. So there's also a change in the object. And for me, that's also right, the whole range of opposite, which from Kant over Hegel is worked out, right? In the subject-object dialectic. And then another question I have is, you were talking about, right, the thing in itself, which we could never touch, right? Only its appearance, so to speak. But that then again is Hegel, right? It's not Hegel, right? But it's Kant. Kant thinks that there's a thing in itself, while Hegel thinks the subject-object relationship is a process in itself, and that the process is the essence. And in a certain way, right, we can never truly interact with the thing in itself, the noumenon, because it doesn't really exist. But we can only, right, what you, I think, explained very well in the beginning, right, this thing of we interact with the appearance of the thing, right, which is due to a concept which we have. And then we can go from, so to speak, the outer shell of this appearance to the essence, which appears through the appearance, right? Sorry for Hegeling around. And so you made this point, and here's how I tried to get it back a little more to the question of history. You said, right, if we don't know an object, we don't know how to interact with it. But isn't this purely abstract? Is there anything, if there is a historical process, is there anything which has not in any kind of way, right, gave us a model which we at least try to apply, even though it might be very wrong, right? And I think you gave very good explanations for how things can be wrong, right? And then how far even wrong things cannot be absolutely wrong, but only wrong in relation to something else. So it seems you wanted to read the kernel, the essence of what Marxism was philosophically against the grain. Why do you think this is important, and what do you hope other people may discover in trying to get into this project which you outlined?
Yeah, so first I have to confess that I didn't read Hegel, at least yet. I don't think I'm ready for it. And
I think you are.
Okay, thank you.
We can teach you.
Yeah, regarding the subject-object dialectics, so when I was talking about interaction, I meant two-way interaction. So when you can actually do something to an object, see how it responds, and make any conclusions based on that. So, for example, when you do biological experiments on rats, you feed one population of rats one thing, you feed another thing, and then you see how they differ in the end. That's just not something we can do with either stars or societies, and of course, you can argue that you don't even have to go into quantum mechanics for that. You can even say that any force that has an opposite, opposite and equal reaction. So Newton's third law, and so when you move over the Earth also moves in the opposite direction under you, just a little bit. But this bit is so little that there is really no practical conclusions that can be derived from observing it. That is a problem. And same with the Marxist organizations. So we can maybe gather like 200, 300 people. We could try organizing even more people, but it is still not really enough to create a sufficient change in a society. And I actually, okay, that I should probably end on that.
Ich glaube, Kat war zuerst.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I myself don't know a lot about like IT or scientific theory, but like I tried to make sense out of it from like what I learn about Marxism and the left. And to me, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong or give me a feedback on how I understood you, but that you were talking like about the naturalization of things that like became, that we need to take something for granted that is created over time. And that you would like say that we accumulated so much knowledge in the left that we feel an impossibility to access all information and to decide which way to go, and that you would propose like some kind of artificial intelligence that we can feed all this experience into, and that would like decide what would be the true way for us.
I definitely didn't propose that. Yeah, so obviously that would be an option too, but for the purposes of this conference, I'm sticking to just the things that you can implement yourself. And yeah, in this case, these are the rules of the discussion. That's basically it. I think I didn't really understand the first part of your question.
Like what was the part with the library and that like one person doesn't have the time to read, I don't know, Gramsci and Hegel and Lenin and Kant and whatever, and like also the proposition that you made that we have like all these discussions that go ad hominem and they get really wild and crazy, and that we would need to write like prompts of the discussions that we have and like feed it into like some machine learning system.
No, in that case, it was meant just for other people. So two people have a discussion. They write a whole lot of text. They read the text of each other, but not everyone can do the same. And so for the mass public, they just write shortened versions of that. That was the idea. Or rather, it was just one possible method of complying with that rule. The rule itself is just that there has to be an option for an external observer to join a discussion without knowing everything that was said before. I could actually expand on the idea of having to understand all of history before doing anything, if you want. I expanded it in the full version, which I'll also talk about.
I think back there. Yeah.
There's a microphone.
Two questions, one short one which might be a little reductive. So the whole talk about vector embedding of information and semantic analysis was to make like a plea to summarize things. And the second question is, don't you think this is risking like the scientific tendency to want simplification, even if that isn't necessarily the truth, or the true describing theory?
Yeah, I think it's actually a similar question to the previous one. So maybe I really should expand on it a little bit. So in dialectics, we have this idea of a person containing resolved contradiction. I might be getting this a little bit wrong, so if anyone is an expert in that,
just continue what you want to say, and we can talk about it later.
Yeah, so history is of course a chain of contradictions which get resolved, and then we produce other contradictions, and it's, so to make another analogy from IT, it's a little bit like blockchain, where each block depends on the previous block, and you cannot know that the current block is true without verifying each previous block. And I'm definitely not saying that there is an easy way out of it. In fact, I think that eventually we'll get to the point where a human lifespan would simply not be enough to retrace the entire history of previous contradictions. And yeah, then we'll just might need artificial means of like extending the lifespan or something else to allow people to actually come to the end of this path and to be able to generate new contradictions and new resolutions for them. Yeah, but that's a tangent, of course.
Thanks for the presentation. Sorry. Thanks for the presentation. What I liked about it, I thought it was very modern. I want to take you up on one of your claims, because you said you see a criticism of like the way Lenin criticized Marxism to be in the best tradition of Marxists criticizing Marxism, right? But I still haven't really understood where your criticism of, let's say, Marxism's criticism of positivism actually is. Like, what is the proposition in that sense that, makes it invalid? And like corresponding to this, I really found it very interesting the way how you framed scientific research or findings becoming seemingly more economic in that sense, which apparently is something we do not automatically presuppose, but which seemingly spontaneously happens when we like investigate nature, right? Which is a very interesting thing, and reminds me of Lukács and the concept of reification, and especially rationalization of production in that sense, which obviously is not just a question of producing goods in like the economic sense, but which seems to me as a fundamental condition of our relationship to reality and to ourselves, like this process of rationalization. So, but this process of rationalization, I think you just seem to pick up and affirm in the sense of that is, the way how we can solve the problem of Marxist organizations, which is really interesting because I just came from a workshop where they tried, to propose a different solution of the problem of Marxist groups splitting. So I think this is a fascinating interrelation. But like I said, again, like the Marxist approach was to criticize in the sense of understand the conditions of possibility for this process of rationalization. And I still don't see where a affirmation, which is something I'm that's how I understood you, would go beyond that. Or is in that sense, like going beyond the Marxist criticism of that phenomena.
Yeah, so the point about rationalization is really interesting and probably something to think about later. Yeah, it's another pretty deep tangent. As for the first point you brought up, that is actually a good point, because that is another thing that I had to drop from the presentation, but that exists in the original text that I will again promote at the end of it.
So which point
So, yeah, that was about criticizing Lenin's criticism of Marx.
Right.
Yeah. So, what I probably should have said but didn't is that I'm not saying that Lenin was wrong or that Marx was wrong. It's just I'm trying to do a dialectical synthesis of both of those approaches, and the part where Marx was wrong is with yeah, I can actually try to explain. So Lenin was criticizing Marx for devolving into solipsism, essentially, and the reason he devolved into solipsism is that his own theory had a contradiction, that when you observe people actually forming their models of the world, you necessarily notice that those models are incompatible, they're contradictory to each other. And if you assume that the economy of thought is a correct way to represent reality, and if this is also a built-in method of the human mind to perceive reality, then it means that each human perceives a different reality, essentially, if you stick to this paradigm to the end. And yeah, that basically means solipsism. If each one has a reality of their own, then we can never agree that there is an objective reality, and yeah, not sure what to do after that. But do you still have
sorry, yeah, but that's like you said, that's Lenin's criticism of Marx. Right?
Yeah, that's also what Marx was wrong about. So the idea that
where was Lenin wrong? Because you said you were doing a dialectical
yeah.
synthesis of both of them.
Yes, Lenin was wrong about completely disregarding the idea of Denkökonomie, because it is still actually a thing, and it just works in the opposite direction. So as you mentioned before, that it's not that we are deliberately seeking simpler representations of reality, it's just that our representations that we eventually find end up being simpler. And Marx probably noticed that and tried to formalize it, but did it in the wrong direction. But the general idea, was kind of right, in essence.
I also wanted to thank you for your presentation. It got me thinking about so many different things. I really enjoyed it. So my question is, the problem you seem to attempt to solve is how people on the left can act and decide together, because that seems impossible right now. The conference is called 100 Years After Lenin. There once was a worldwide socialist movement, even though it failed. Why were people once able to act together, make decisions together, and are now not anymore?
Yeah, that's that probably goes quite out of the scope of my presentation. I could try to answer simply that I don't think it really wasn't different before that. So my personal opinion is that it's more about coincidences, so that it's not like people were inherently better at communicating back then. To an extent, writing books to each other and sending them in the mail was a bit more productive than arguing on Twitter. But the fundamental problems were still more or less the same. And even though there was a global socialist movement, it's not like people in that movement actually agreed on things. It was more an alliance of convenience, I think. But yeah, that is just an opinion, and I'm definitely not very qualified to to talk about that.
Basically, I had a similar question than Lara. Maybe this helps if I rephrase it, and maybe you can expand. So you said like your point of departure for this lecture, for your whole like theoretical journey, is the impasse that you feel that the union of Marxists is at. You know, that you feel that theory and practice is disconnected. And then we just talked about like the global socialist movement of Lenin's time, where you said that he thought it was possible to bridge the gap of objective reality and the model by practice. And then you just said, okay, maybe it was the problem that they didn't agree, but didn't they have with the Socialist Mass Party internationally at least some sort of means of experimentation, like a means with which you can like find out what is the right theoretical approach, something that is in a constant feedback loop? And why do you think, do you agree that this was the case back then? And if yes, what do you think was different back then to the present moment?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because I think that's probably the most valid way of looking at the socialist experiment of the 20th century is exactly as an experiment. So yes, it was probably the only point in history when experimentation on the entire society was actually conducted. And yeah, that was of course only possible after the socialists took power. So their theories before that had to be based on something else. And even after they took power, it's yeah, there are still a lot of problems after that, because although you might have the power to conduct an experiment, you might still want to ask yourself if you should. And yeah, that's just not a question with an easy answer.
Can I just follow up one question? Do you say that, like, is there like an ethical, moral kind of thing in your head where you say maybe we should not try this only politically in that sense, because like this is just a too gigantic and dangerous form of experimentation, that we should have a better prediction model beforehand, before really trying it? Is that your like LA?
The problem is that my specialization is building prediction models. So of course I'm biased in that direction. I totally respect people who want to do more practice, and I definitely don't think that we can get anywhere without people with practical experience. But yeah, the main problem is that practice has to be informed by theory, and theory has to be adjusted by practice. So as the famous saying goes, practice, how was it? Theory without practice is dead, and practice without theory is blind. Was it actually Lenin or not? I'm not sure.
So, thank you for the presentation. I'm also very excited about this topic. So I'd love to continue the conversation after this. But and actually, I was going to ask very similar questions. And one additional question, I think, is, so I just want to, like, I just also don't really like the comparison of astronomy to social theory, because I think it's, in social theory, the problem is precisely that you're forced to interact with your object, and what you say about it is becoming part of the object. If you're, you know, like, if, for example, you want to know where the stars are going to be, right? So you come up with an astronomical model that will tell you when the next solar eclipse will be. Then you test it out, but the fact that you predicted when the next solar eclipse will be didn't affect whether it would happen or not. At least I don't think it does. Yeah. But with the case of society, either you're capable of acting on the scale in which you're thinking, or you're not, and you're just an individual. If you're an individual, Of course, you can make predictions about what's going to happen, but you cannot act on them. And if you're big enough to act on your predictions, then your predictions are already a force acting in the world, if you know what I mean. And I think that's what makes... I think that gestures at something like what makes social theory dialectical almost by necessity, or like one form of contradiction in it, that you try to make a prediction, but if you're big enough to, you know, for your actions to actually matter, then your predictions conditioned by all the scientific knowledge and so on that came before become part of the world. And I feel like in Marxism, at its best, we find an attempt to work through this problem in a way, and that to work through the problem that we are, and I think that kind of speaks to the solipsism as well, like we work through the problem that our impressions of the world are conditioned by the world and are a part of our world through our actions and so on. And I guess you express a very important frustration, like to me also a very important frustration about the fact that, you know, how do we even do theory if we don't have a mass movement and so on? And is it not possible that the answer is that we just can't? Or like, I don't know. What if we just can't do social theory with, I don't know.
that was surprisingly pessimistic a bit. So what I'll say first is that if you are big enough, you can also move stars. You can do anything if you are big enough. You just need to mine whole planets, build ginormous structures, but it's totally doable. It is exactly the same as with building a socialist country, basically. The question is, of course, how you do it, and yeah, so with the point of what we say affecting the object of our research, yeah, that is definitely a problem that lies very deep in the core of Marxism, and I might try to give giving a simple explanation to that. Of course, a very simple explanation is usually wrong, but it's something. And to me, it seems that an individual can only affect the large-scale processes of society by writing or saying something when what he is writing or saying is predicting the trajectory of society. So, for example, yeah, actually, I have a good example from Lenin too. You know, everyone thinks that the program of the RSDRP, so the Leninist Party before revolution, was the program that was like it is the gold standard of how we should write programs for communist parties, and I strongly disagree with that. I think that there is also a second program of the Bolshevik Party, which Lenin actually specifically called the second program of the party, and that is the Goel-Rowe plan. That is the first economic plan of the Soviet Union. So yeah, Lenin explicitly said that it is the second program of the party, and I think it is a much better example of what a program should be, because it predicted how capitalist production would evolve, and it suggested that the Soviet Union should jump ahead of it. So basically, instead of waiting until all the feedback loops in the economy work their way through, we should just build the infrastructure for the production forces that would inevitably emerge, and basically get a head start of the capitalist countries. And that's how they built a lot of the electrical infrastructure, a lot of rail infrastructure, and the most important part is that it actually worked. in those industries affected by the plan, the productivity in the Soviet Union was actually higher than in the capitalist countries. Yeah, that's actually a long time already. So the point is that if you can predict how society will develop, and you can lay out a program for it. So basically, if you satisfy a need that exists to explain what do we need to do at this moment, then you can actually affect the development of the state. Problem is, so there's a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma, because if you're trying to predict something that you're not, it's not like you have a free choice. A prediction is just something that follows from the theory, and you don't get to choose what you predict. So in that sense, you could say that it's actually not possible to affect society. That would be, of course, a reductive argument, but it has its own merits. Yeah, but the whole idea of materialism in application to society is that you cannot just write some random book, let's say, and suddenly an entire society starts following your book. So it's not like someone just wrote the Bible and then suddenly millions of people became Christian. That's very idealistic view of society. And the question is, where in that dichotomy between reductive materialism and pure idealism lies the truth? So, can we affect anything? Can we affect everything, or can we not affect anything? And probably both of those extremes are wrong, and the dialectical materialism is the idea of searching for the truth between them. Okay, that was very long.
I think we have room for one last short question. Yeah, maybe the gentleman here.
I just ask another question. So all also know, Lud is rebellion to the Roma, this Roma British. Yeah. So now German can be in a rebellion to the U.S. So U.S. now became the empire, like Roma, like Vatican, U.S. So if some people like Lud in German, they rebel U.S., they rebel the finance, the central financial system. If a man or a country like Lud to rebelling this system, so it will maybe in the future they will maybe become truth, become true. This is my thinking. So because Lud success rebelling the church, the Roma, Lud and the German, Lud and the German success rebelling against the central government. So maybe some people or some country like Lud, like German, to against the central government, like U.S. Financial system. So maybe there will be success. Maybe.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of a continuation of the previous question, in that sense that, yeah, like if you look at the history retroactively, you can see that there are sometimes situations where some dude just wrote a random pamphlet, stapled it onto a church door, and suddenly a revolution happens. Problem is that it wasn't really that suddenly. The conditions for that revolution already existed in society, and sometimes it just takes a person to articulate the new requirements of the society that would push it onto the next stage of development. But it doesn't mean that this person has a lot of agency in selecting the direction of this development. So it's like, yeah, so the idealistic view of history is that like exceptional people make the history move forward, and the materialistic view of history is that the history moves forward through exceptional people, something like that.
Maybe this can be.
Who knows?
Okay, so thank you so much, Alexander, for your workshop. And we will continue our discussion at 7 in the big audience hall with the panel in German on revisionism and anti-revisionism.
Oh, it's in German.
Yeah.
And you know what? I still didn't mention that there's actually a full article where I explain all of what I said today in much more depth, but I don't really know how to share it.
You can send it to me. I can share it with most of the participants.
Okay.
If you send it to me. Again, you already sent it to me, but maybe send it again.
All right, that's right.
Thank you. Spasiba. Jakob, dein Telefon?
Schauen wir mal, wie wir es jetzt hier schicken können, oder?
Schau mal, ja, du musst es wahrscheinlich irgendwie